Last weekend, a new Star Trek movie dropped on Paramount Plus, so now it's time to rank all 14 of the Star Trek movies from the worst to the best. Now, just so you know where I'm coming from, I do not at all consider myself a Trekkie. My only exposure to this universe was the Chris Pine movies. I tried to get into the other ones when those were coming out, but was never really able to do it, so with the exception of the Chris Pine movies and Wrath of Khan, these were all first-time watches. With that in mind, let's get started. In last place is Star Trek the Motion Picture. The biggest problem with this movie is it's just very slow. There's a scene early in the film of Kirk and Bones entering the Enterprise, and it takes up 3 whole minutes of screen time. This movie is like 20% plot and 80% establishing shots of the Enterprise. What little plot this movie does have isn't very interesting. It feels like it's trying to copy the style of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. The movie also came out 2 years after Star Wars: A New Hope, yet the effects in New Hope are much better than the effects in this movie. But this movie crawled so Wrath of Khan could run. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Number 13, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, also known as The One with the Whales. This movie was directed by Leonard Nimoy, which in and of itself is kind of interesting. A lot of people say that the even-numbered Star Trek movies are the good ones, but in my opinion, this is an exception. It's definitely a product of the times, and it's so preachy that it makes James Cameron's Avatar look subtle. And what doesn't make sense is the two whales are named George and Gracie, who are named after George Burns and Gracie Allen, a comedy duo from way back in the 50s, so it's kind of weird that these people, thousands of years into the future, would get that reference. There's only one good bit in this.
Well, yeah, I'll buy that. What about him?
Him? He's harmless. Back in the 60s, he was part of the free speech movement at Berkeley. I think he did a little too much LDS.
LDS?
By the end of this movie, I was singing this one song from Studio C.
High seas, let's kill the whales. If you care about children, kill the whales. Put dynamite in their blowholes. Kill the whales, they're crowding up the largest body of water known to man. There's not enough space. Kill the whales.
That's how much I didn't like this movie. Number 12, Star Trek Insurrection. Oh boy. A movie that expects the audience to have watched the Deep Space Nine series, with an uninteresting plot that doesn't feel like it justifies being made into a movie, rather just a very long episode. The crew visits the Amish. There's not a lot you can do with that. Just overall a very bland film. Number 11, The Search for Spock. The first Trek movie to be directed by Leonard Nimoy. I liked Christopher Lloyd's performance as the villain, there were some good space fights. The film undoes Spock's sacrifice from Wrath of Khan, rendering it meaningless. It's not a bad film per se, it just has a few issues, but I found it more entertaining than the other films lower on the list. Number 10, The Final Frontier. This one directed by William Shatner. I liked the Mad Max vibes, there was some nice humor that was intentionally placed and not funny because it's so bad. I actually found myself getting into the plot of this one a bit more. I enjoyed the villain and getting more insight into Spock's backstory. Number 9, Star Trek Generations. Now, as a non-Trekkie, I obviously didn't get as hyped for this movie as a lot of the Trekkies may have when it came out, but I can still understand why the idea of this film was cool. It's the equivalent of the Doctor Who Day of the Doctor episode, or Spider-Man No Way Home, where we have the old and new crossing over. The villain was pretty well written and well acted, but so little happens in this movie until the last 30 minutes. Given the premise, it should have been a lot more interesting. Number 8, Star Trek Beyond. It's odd how Justin Lin was able to make some of the best Fast and Furious movies, but his Star Trek movie turned out so blah. Given the tone of the previous two movies in this timeline, it doesn't feel like the same universe, and the twist of who the villain is incredibly obvious. Number 7, Star Trek Nemesis. One of the better Trek films despite its reputation. Tom Hardy is awesome as the villain, it's got great action, and it presents ideas about nature versus nurture and man's capacity of both good and evil like Jekyll and Hyde in an interesting way. Number 6, Undiscovered Country. This has better political commentary than the Star Wars prequels. I found it very thrilling, and when you look at the time it came out, the film used the humans in Klingon as an allegory for tensions between Russians and Americans, and ironically, the ones representing Americans are the ones wearing red. I found this one a lot more interesting than I was expecting. Number 5, Star Trek Into Darkness. This is essentially a remake of Wrath of Khan. Benedict Cumberbatch is great as Khan, and I liked how they changed it slightly by having the famous death scene from Wrath of Khan be Kirk dying instead of Spock. What holds it back is, unlike the first Chris Pine movie, which felt like something fresh and different, this is, like I said, just derivative of Wrath of Khan. If the plot had gone in a somewhat different direction, it may have been higher on this list. Number 4, Star Trek 31. This is a very different flavor than the other Star Trek films, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The films based on Next Generation had a different style than the ones based on the original series. The Chris Pine movies were very different from any of those, so I didn't mind it too much. Now, some people may not like that the soundtrack consists of pop rock music, but if you remember, the Chris Pine ones had Beastie Boys as the soundtrack, so it didn't feel that out of place to me. This is a Trek film that stands on its own and doesn't expect you to have any prior knowledge of anything, similar to how Moon Knight was a pretty good standalone MCU project, and how the first season of Mandalorian was pretty standalone. Michelle Yeoh does a great job in the film. The tone is basically Suicide Squad meets Guardians of the Galaxy, and as someone who enjoyed both of those films, I enjoyed this one as well. Now, there are some pacing issues, particularly with how the film feels somewhat episodic, like this was originally supposed to be a series. They changed to a movie at the last second. The actor who plays the villain can also overact a bit at times. It feels pretty cartoony. The humor in the movie also feels a bit forced, and for me, it didn't work. And the dialogue that was supposed to be humorous fell really flat. But what the film does well is its slick action sequences and editing. If you're just a Trekkie and you're looking for just a fun sci-fi action film, this is for you, but I can see why Trekkie loyalists may not enjoy it. Basically, if you saw the trailer and thought, this isn't for me, it's not going to surprise you. But if you saw the trailer and thought, this looks fun, it's worth checking out. Before I give you my top 3, sharing your ranking of the Trek movies, we'll probably disagree. That's what makes this fun. Let's have a lively but respectful discussion. Number 3, Wrath of Khan. Of course, this is one of the most iconic sci-fi films of all time. This came out in 1982, which also had some of the greatest films of all time, such as E.T., Poltergeist, and many others. A vast improvement over Star Trek the Motion Picture, because this one has an actual plot. The characters feel more emotional, and actually looks like a movie instead of a show. Number 2, First Contact. I really enjoyed the different flavor of this one. This was quite unexpectedly a horror movie. It also has Neil McDonough, which is always a plus because he's great in everything. However, going into this as a non-Trekkie, I found a lot of it hard to follow because it expects you to know who the Borg are. Also, the Cochrane subplot feels very unnecessary and is just there to pad the runtime. It also has one of the dumbest lines in any of these movies.
And you people, you're all astronauts on some kind of Star Trek.
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
And in first place is Star Trek 2009. Out of all of these, this has the best cast, the best villain, has a very slick style to it, manages to be its own thing while also paying tribute to what came before. It knows that by today's standards, not all of the old Star Trek holds up, so this was a way to get a new generation of fans. And
Hey, farm boy.
and I think it worked. It's the most exciting, has the best plot, and it comes in at number 1. So go ahead and share your ranking of these Star Trek movies in the comments, and I'll see you next time.